Ani, bonjour. So I guess we'll get started. So Josh Anandabe Dishna Cause, Wiikwemkoong Makwa Dodem. I'm currently an assistant professor at Brock University in the history department, and I've been asked today to speak about the history of treaties in Manitoulin Island. So I want to focus on the history of the Anishinaabeg people in the 1836 treaty, both the Bonhead 1836 agreement and the 1836 Treaty of Washington. So I have a slideshow that I am going to share. Can everybody see my slides? So the title of my presentation is From Alliance to Irrelevance. So in order to understand treaties, we need to understand the doctrine of discovery and the reason why European colonizers were allowed to colonize our lands. So the doctrine of discovery was non-Christians could not legally own land. So if you were not a Christian, you cannot legally own land. So prior to 1492, there were some papal bulls that were created over in Europe and Spain, and they were saying that indigenous peoples could not own land. So indigenous peoples were considered pagan and we were considered savage. So we were not allowed to legally own title to lands. And thus North America and the rest of the Americas were considered terra nullius. Terra nullius means that the land was empty, like a land that was empty with wilderness. So European settlers considered the lands in North America as empty and free for the taking. And there was the natural right versus the civil rights. How did First Nations utilize the land? So First Nations were considered to have a natural right that they didn't divide their lands up into sections and plots. And Europeans were considered to have what was called a civil right. So a civil right was that they divided up their lands into plots, and it was owned by certain people, and they considered their farming techniques modern for like civilizing the land. Can everybody see my slides? I'm not sure if this is working correctly.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. So indigenous civilizations, to understand Aboriginal rights, we must understand the meaning of civilization. So civilization is the accumulation of the tradition and cultures of a people through dance, music, art, law, religion, and histories, whether written or oral. So each First Nation exercised Aboriginal rights within its own lands and boundaries and under its own sovereignty. So Indigenous peoples, we had our own civilizations in North America before Europeans arrived. We had our own forms of dance, our own music, our own art, our own law, our own spirituality, and our own oral histories. So Aboriginal peoples govern themselves through Aboriginal rights within Indigenous civilizations. So Indigenous nationhood. So in order to have nationhood, people have to have a permanent population. They have a defined territory. They have a government. They have the ability to enter into international relations with other states. For example, the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So prior to European arrival, we had agreements with the Haudenosaunee people, with the Iroquois people, that we had the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So democracy was already flourishing in North America when settlers arrived. Some First Nations, like the Haudenosaunee, had organized governments. So they influenced the U.S. nation to make a union among the 13 colonies. So when the United States formed its government in 1776, they got the idea of the 13 united colonies, the original 13 states. They got that idea from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of six united nations. And that's where they based their government system on, was they based it off indigenous governance systems that we had before Europeans arrived. So some of the type of technologies we had in industry we had were fishing. So the Odawa and the Wendat, who are also known as the Huron, were fishing in the Great Lakes for thousands of years. We used what we called the gill net and the dip net. We also made fish weirs. There's a evidence of fish fence in Magikening and Rama near Orillia, Ontario. So the word Magikening actually means the fence, the fish fence. So a lot of our communities today, we're at the location of where the fishing sites were located. So when they made the First Nations communities, the Indian Reserve System, when they made the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and the treaties, a lot of these Anishinaabe communities where they are today were located where they had these fishing sites where they were able to catch all of their fish. So Michilimackinac at the Straits of Mackinac City and St. Agnes was a very vital, important location for the Odawa people, and same with Sault Ste. Marie. So at Boating, there would be over 5,000 Anishinaabe would gather there in the summertime to fish. And also Manitoulin Island was a very important spot for fishing. So when Europeans came, they had massive extraction of cod from the North Atlantic by Europeans, and Europeans fishermen called the Grand Banks mounted beneath the sea. So that's how much fish were. Fishing was a large industry in North America when settlers arrived. So Aboriginal attitudes toward the land. So Aboriginal people believe we are one with the earth and the earth is one with us. We have the right to govern our own people and our own land. We made laws to govern ourselves and the use of the land and its resources. Aboriginal people believe that no individual owns the land. The land was given to people by the Creator, not to own, but to protect and use the land wisely. So these are some of the teachings that we carry as Anishinaabe and our attitudes towards the land. So this is just a quote that was taken in 1820. So Indigenous reliance on the land. So this is an Indigenous person talking, and they say, "We had then room enough and plenty of deer, which was easily caught, and though we had not knives, hatchets, or guns, such as we have now, yet we had knives of stone and hatchets of stone and bows and arrows, and those served our use as well then as the English ones do now. We are now straitened and sometimes in want of deer and liable to many other inconveniences since the English came among us, and particularly from that pen and ink work that is going on at the table. So when he's talking about the pen and ink work, they're talking about the treaties that were being signed between the indigenous peoples and the Europeans. So they're talking about that before Europeans arrived, we knew how to manage the lands and that we didn't have European tools before. We had our own tools, our own ways of our own technologies of how we utilize and we use the land. So one of the concepts, philosophies of the land is I mentioned this a little bit earlier, was the dish with one spoon treaty. So this is a picture of the dish with one spoon belt, and this was the original one of the agreements we had with the Haudenosaunee before Europeans arrived. So in the middle of the belt is the purple part, and in the middle of the purple is the white. So the purple around it represents the bowl, or what we call the dish, which actually represents the land and all the resources that we get from the land, whether it's wood, whether it's food from the animals, and different resources, growing food in the soil, such as corn. And in the middle of the purple part is the white. That little white part there represents the beaver tail, which represents the food that we would all share the resources within the same geographic space. So the agreement that we had with the Haudenosaunee was between our two buffer, there was a buffer zone between our two nations where our two lands were, the Anishinaabe people and then the Haudenosaunee people. And kind of in between that geographic landscape, we would share the territory, and we had this agreement with them. So this is some of the concepts we had of sharing territory with other indigenous nations, was the dish with one spoon agreement. This is the two-row wampum belt. This was the very first treaty that took place between Europeans and indigenous peoples. It was first agreed upon in 1613 between the Dutch and the Mohawk, and it was also became known as the Covenant Chain relationship. So they had a belt called the Covenant Chain, where the Haudenosaunee people, anybody that they considered allies, they would bring them into that Covenant Chain alliance. So they brought the Dutch into the alliance with them, and then that was also passed on to the British when the British and the English took over the alliance, and then eventually the Anishinaabe were adopted into the Covenant Chain Alliance at the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. But this original belt in 1613, the two rows of purple, as we could see on the belt, the top side represents the indigenous canoe or the indigenous way of life, and at the bottom on the purple row is the British ship or the European way of life. And what the philosophy is behind the two row is that the indigenous way of life and the European way of life will not interfere with each other, that we will share the land together and we will travel side by side down the river of life. So in the middle between those two rows, it represents the river of life, that we are traveling together down this river of life and that we are sharing the land as equals, and that each system would not interfere with the other. So our governance systems were not supposed to interfere with each other. And this was the original philosophy of the two row. So that was the very first treaty that we had with Europeans, and it became known as the Covenant Chain Alliance. So this is just a picture of the history of the Covenant Chain. So when they first made the Covenant Chain, they said we will tie a rope to the British ship to the capital of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at the time. And then later on, as time went on, they said, well, we value our friendship even stronger. and that rope will break. So we're gonna turn our friendship into an iron chain, and this iron chain will represent this covenant chain alliance that we have with each other. But later on, by the 18th century, they said with the British, we said we value our friendship even more, even stronger, because iron will turn to rust. So we want to call it the silver covenant chain. We're going to turn our friendship into a silver chain that's going to be polished. And what that means is when they polish the chain, that means that they're renegotiating the treaty, that the treaty is ongoing. The treaty never ends. It's ongoing. So right now, what we're doing with this Robinson-Huron Treaty agreement that we have with the crown, we're polishing the chain right now, and that's what that means when they say polishing the silver covenant chain. So the origins of the covenant chain. So as I just explained, so in 1613, the first international treaty was conducted between the Dutch and the Mohawk. That was known as the Two-Row Wampum Treaty. It was later referred to as the Covenant Chain of Alliance and Friendship. There were separate agreements conducted during the 17th century where the British would renew their alliance with the Haudenosaunee in the Covenant Chain Alliance. In 1764, the Anishinaabeg would become a part of the Silver Covenant Chain. So we were later adopted into this Covenant Chain Alliance with the British and the Haudenosaunee in 1764 at the Treaty of Niagara. So what is a treaty? Is it a piece of paper? Is it a nation-to-nation agreement? Is it a wampum belt? Is it an ongoing relationship? Well, according to Indigenous peoples, according to the Anishinaabe, we consider that it is all of the above. We acknowledge the piece of paper that was written. We acknowledge that it is a nation-to-nation agreement. We ratify our treaties through wampum. So we use wampum belts to ratify the agreement. So we consider the wampum belt a treaty, and we consider it an ongoing relationship, that this relationship will never end, that it is ongoing. So treaties are not static. That means that they are not stuck in time. They're ongoing, and we will always polish that chain, the silver covenant chain, that relationship that we have with the crown, with the British crown. So reasons for making a treaty was usually to heal harm caused by settler colonialism and warfare, compensate for lands taken illegally, to end unfair trade and commerce practices. So protect our indigenous economy, to make up for unfulfilled promises. So right now, we are renewing and polishing this alliance, this covenant chain with this Robinson-Huron treaty, this annuity, this agreement. There was harm caused by settler colonialism, that the annuities were not respected since after the treaty was signed. So that's what we're doing right now. We're in an agreement and renegotiation with the crown, and we're renegotiating our treaties. So customary treaty practices. So kindling the council fire. So this is what they would consider when they would first open up the treaty, when they had their treaty negotiations, they would kindle the council fire. So that means that they're stoking the fire, they're starting up the conversations, and the meeting is going to start. And they would have a ceremony called wiping the tears, uplifting the minds. So the wiping of the tears was called a condolence ceremony. So when we had the agreement with the other nations, whether it was with Europeans, they would forgive the past grievances that took place, whether people passed away or people died in warfare. They would forgive each other for all the harm that was caused, and that would be called wiping the tears, uplifting the minds. So they're clearing the mind, they're getting rid of all the old bad tensions that happened between the two parties. And burying the tomahawk, which means that they were going to make peace. They're going to bury the hatchet. So replanting the tree of peace. So they would replant the tree of peace and they would polish the chain of friendship. So they would renegotiate the treaty, the agreement. They're polishing the chain and covering the grave. So again, talking about those people that have passed on, that went on before us, whether they were leaders or warriors that have fallen. That's called covering the grave. And smoking the pipe of peace. We had that ceremony with the pipe where our prayers were answered. Our prayers are sent to the Creator through the tobacco, and smoking of the tobacco in the pipe, and we're talking to the Creator. And then at the end of the negotiations, at the end of the treaty conference, they would cover the fire. That means that they're ending the treaty, they're ending the negotiations, they're ending the meeting. So these were some of the treaty practices that took place when we had treaties with other nations and Europeans. So the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt. So the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt, this is a picture of the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt at the bottom. But what it represents here are these three links. So this is a metaphor that is used that is based on the Covenant Chain. So the metaphor is based on three links. See these three men standing there, they represent the three links. So the first link means that we will have friendship. When we make the treaty, we will have friendship with each other. And the second link means we will both have good minds. So that means that we had that ceremony, that wiping of the tears, that condolence ceremony. We're clearing our mind. We're getting rid of all those bad tensions and all those bad feelings. And we're going to have a good mind at the negotiation. And the third link means that we will always have peace. There will be peace between us, between the two parties at the negotiation. So these wampum belts were actually peace belts. And this is the covenant chain agreement, the metaphor that was used. So I just wanted to show you this picture. This is a picture of a painting that Champlain took shortly after he met the Odawa people. So he first met the Odawa up by the French River, between the French River and Point Grandin in August of 1615. And he drew a portrait of our men, how our men looked. And he said that the Odawa men would wear their hair sticking straight up, and they were called the raised hairs, the nation of the raised hairs. And they had their bodies covered in tattoos. We carried a large shield that was made out of buffalo hide, or some say moose hide. But they say that we also traded buffalo robes with the nations of West, and we had a long bow, and we carried our arrows. And at the bottom it says here, a high-hair warrior protected by an enormous shield with his bow and arrow. He has tattoos on his legs, a custom that intrigued voyagers in the 17th century. And so this is a picture of the first, this is how our Odawa men looked, and that's a portrait of that Champlain drew when he met our people. So the Odawa tribes and their neighbors. So the Odawa people were, they had their own confederacy, their own alliance called I would call it the Odawa Alliance, or the Ottawa Confederacy. So there was the Kisgun Odawas. They were called the Cuttails. And that word, the Kisgun, actually comes from the word Tigishkan, which actually means it's cut, but it's referring to the bear, where the bear used to have a long tail and his tail got cut. So that's that relationship that we had with the Bear Nation. And they say that these Tigishka and Odawa used to live on the Bruce Peninsula. So anywhere between Owen Sound and Tobermory today, that's where they used to live. And then there was the Sable Odawa. The French called them the Sable. It was a French word that means people of the fine sandy beach. And there's another word. They called themselves the Kamiga, the Kamiga Odawa, and these are the Odawa who lived on Manitoulin Island. And I think it's making reference to a large Odawa village that used to be in Providence Bay at the Mindamoya River. So where the Mindamoya River is, Providence Bay going into Lake Mindamoya, there's a river there. And along that river, there was a very large Odawa village that was there. So that would have been there in the 15th century, so in the 1400s, all during the 1500s before we met the French. So that was one of the largest Odawa villages on Manitoulin was, and all along that southern coast of Manitoulin, you have those large sand dunes and the fine sandy beach. And then there was the Sinago Odawa, known as the Black Squirrels. And in the historical record, it says that the Sinago Odawa lived on the southern shore of Lake Huron. There is a possibility that these groups moved back and forth to Manitoulin as well, because there is stories that our people lived on Manitoulin Island during the summer, and they would travel to different places during the winter and spring, and they would follow where the maple bush was. So some Odawa groups would go back into Michigan or go back into where they would find these large hardwood stands and do the tapping the maple trees in the spring. Or a lot of them would go to hunting territories where they would hunt. So some groups moved south down towards the Grand River or towards the Chicago area as well. Our Odawa people traveled all through Michigan and the Manitoulin Lake Huron area. And then there was the Naskutins Odawa. They were called the Fork River, or some people call it a Fork Lake. And they say that these Odawa lived around Saginaw Bay or Thunder Bay, Michigan, around that area. There's a river system there. There's actually one south of Saginaw Bay where the river looks like a fork. And then there was the Gnoja, the Pike Odawa. And in 1671, the Pike Odawa were living in they were originally from Manitoulin Island, and they had to move to Wisconsin, but they came back in 1671, and it says that the Pike Odawa returned back to Manitoulin, and they were known as the Gnoja, the Pike Odawa. And I think these Pike Odawa lived in Wiikwemkoong, on the southern part of Wiikwemkoong, probably around the Doganing area. And there was the Mi'kmaq, the Beaver Clan people. So they were a sub-tribe of the Odawa. And these Mi'kmaq lived on the north shore of Georgian Bay. So all the way from the French River, where Killarney is, going towards where the north shore where Espanola is, and going into Wiikwemkoong Bay. So Wiikwemkoong is Wiikwemkoong, the Bay of the Beaver. It means that the Beaver people, the Beaver Clan people, had lived inside the bay, and that's where that it's making reference to this group of people called the Mi'kmaq, and they were the clan, the Beaver Clan people of the Odawa. And then the other neighbors that we had were the Wendats and the Paytons. The Paytons were known as tobacco people, and they lived down at Nottawasaga Bay and around Midland, Ontario. And then we had the Nipissings, who lived to the east of us. And we also had the Ojibwe, who lived to the north of us and the northwest of us around Lake Superior, and also the Budweiademi, who lived in parts of southern Michigan. So these are the Odawa tribes and their neighbors. So the French and Odawa meeting. So Champlain's voyage up the Ottawa River across into Lake Nipissing, down the French River into the Manitoulin Wiikwemkoong area in 1615. So the main village site in Wiikwemkoong at this time in the mid 17th century was about 1 kilometers inland down the river. So present day where that creek near Henry Pelche is his place there, down that river, down that creek. That's where the original village was, going towards all along that where that creek goes to the Kimwan residence, that whole river on both sides of the river, that's where the village was. So the Odawa became the main allies with the French during the fur trade after the Huron are annihilated by Seneca and Mohawk war parties in Midland in 1649. And then the first church is built in Wiikwemkoong in the 1660s. Well, there was a mission there in 1648. Father Poncet spent the winter in Wiki, and in 1671 they built another mission in Murray Hill, where the Kimwan residence is there, and it was called the Mission Saint Simon. And the first one that was built in 1648 was called Saint Peter Mission. So those were the two missions that were built in Wiikwemkoong in the 17th century. So this is just a map of Manitoulin in 1657. So when we zoom in on this map, you could see they're calling Manitoulin the EK Teuton, which is actually a Wendat word. It's describing Manitoulin. It's a Wendat word. This is what the Wendat called Manitoulin. And it's a word that actually makes reference to the southern shore of Manitoulin, that a lot of debris used to wash up on the shore. But it says POP, and this map is in Latin, and it means POP is populous, which means that there are people living on this island. And when I look at this map closely, it looks like there's little dwellings, like you could see above where the French River is. It looks like they're little dwellings. They look like little wigwams. And over by Sault Ste. Marie, it says populous, and it shows some little wigwams there. So it's indicating that there's a large village there. And then you could see these little, kind of like these little wigwams on the map where Manitoulin is. So it's showing that there's people living there. So these were the Odawa people living on Manitoulin in 1657. So in 1671, there was a large ceremony that took place in Sault Ste. Marie. So the governor, the intendant, Talon, appointed St. Lusson to seek out copper mines in the Anishinaabeg Aki, which are the homelands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Nipissing, and Mississauga. So they were in search of copper, and they wanted to claim all the lands for New France. So on June 4th, 1671, St. Lusson held a large ceremonial gathering with 14 indigenous nations. He claimed he called this land the Pays de Hut for France, and they asserted New France over Anishinaabe Aki. So actually it was Anishinaabe territory. All of the lands were Anishinaabe, going all the way around Lake Superior, the whole south coast of Lake Superior into Wisconsin, Minnesota, all of Michigan, Manitoulin, and Northern Ontario. These are all Anishinaabe lands. And New France had claimed they wanted to claim the land all the way down to the Mississippi, and they called it the Pays de Hut. So they did this in 1671. So around this time, the French first observed the people down in the Illinois country doing the Comlet dance, the Comlet ceremony. And this was the first time that the French had observed our ceremony, our our pipe ceremony. And this is a picture of an Odawa holding a long comlet. So these pipes were actually really long. They weren't short like the pipes we have today. They were like 4 or 5 feet long, and they would be decorated with the feathers and different decorations on them. But you could see that this Odawa man here, he has a big tattoo on his chest, and it's the picture of the sun. So what that actually represents is that our connection that we had to the East Coast, where the sun rises, that we acknowledged our story of that Anishinaabe migration story coming from the East, that we had connections to the people that lived on the East Coast where the sun rises. So that's what that tattoo represents there. So we have the Great Peace of Montreal, August 4th, 1701. There was a treaty signed between 39 Indigenous nations, 1,300 Indigenous leaders, and the French. So this ended half a century of warfare between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee during the Beaver Wars. So between 1650 and 1671, there was these wars going on with the Haudenosaunee, with the Iroquois, with the Nodwek, known as the Beaver Wars, and they were fighting over the trade, the furs. The Haudenosaunee wanted to take over the Anishinaabe territory, and they wanted to start controlling the fur trade all the way from New York State down to up north to James Bay, because the English were up there, and the Hudson's Bay Company they were called, and they were in alliance with the Haudenosaunee at the time, so they were trying to they wanted to control the whole interior, and that was our territory. So after the war was over, when we drove the Haudenosaunee back into New York State, they had a big peace conference in 1701, and the Haudenosaunee agreed with this new French fort being established at Detroit. So the French wanted to build a new fort in our territory, and they built it over at Detroit. And at the same time, the Haudenosaunee signed the Nanfan Treaty during the same summer. So they were claiming the whole Ohio country as their hunting grounds, all the land south of Lake Erie. So that was the Great Peace of Montreal of 1701. And this is just a picture of the treaty, the 1701 Peace of Montreal Treaty, and all the Anishinaabe, the indigenous people who were at the treaty, they all signed with their totem. And when you do more research on this treaty, it will show the actual Odawa leaders that were there, the chiefs. It says their names, the names of the chiefs, of the Odawa chiefs, and it shows their totem, the ones that they signed. So all of those groups, those ones I talked about, the Tigishkans, the Sables, the Naskutins, and the Senegos, and the Mi'kmaq, they were all represented at this peace, 1701 peace conference, and they're all on this treaty, and they all sign with their specific totem. And the Mi'kmaq, when they're at this treaty, their chief, the Odawa chief, actually speaks for the Mi'kmaq, and he signs on the behalf of the Mi'kmaq. So that's how I found out that the Mi'kmaq were actually Odawa people, because of this treaty documentation in 1701, because the chief of the Odawas actually speaks on behalf of the Mi'kmaq there, and he signs the totem there representing the Mi'kmaq. So this is the original name for Fort Detroit, Fort Pontchartrain. So some Odawa had moved south to Detroit, so there was lots of Odawa living on Manitoulin Island. So a lot of them moved south. They moved to Detroit in 1701 because of the fort. They want to be close to the fort. And there was a chief named Boy, and so on September 3rd in 1700, he says, Boy presents a wampum belt to Governor Calories. His speech says he spoke for the 4 Odawa nations, the Odawa of the Sable, the Odawa Senegal, the Tigishkans, and the Odawa of the Fork, the Nisakwatins. So he's he's a grand chief for the Odawa, and he's saying that he speaks for all four of these Odawa nations. So we're all in alliance with each other, all these Odawa groups that lived all around Lake Huron, at Michilimackinac, at Manitoulin, on the Bruce Peninsula, all along the south shore of Lake Huron, which would be down in Michigan area, going all the way down to Detroit, where Wapo Island is, that whole area that was all Odawa territory all around Lake Huron. So we had the Fox Wars from 1712 to 1716, and then again between 1728 and 1733. So the French wanted to control the Fox River system leading to the Mississippi, and they got help from the Anishinaabeg. So the Anishinaabeg actually started helping the French fighting the Fox, and that's when we began our alliance with the French during this time, during the fur trade. And this is a map in 1703. And as you can see on this map, where Manitoulin Island is, where you look north of Manitoulin, you could see Le'emikku, which means the Mi'kmaq, and it's showing the north shore of Georgian Bay, the Mi'kmaq people, and there's two villages there. It looks like where Killarney is today. And then we also have the Mississauga. So I'm talking about Mississauga, where Blind River is, and then it shows Saint Marie. But right above that, it says Otwoks. So that's plural for Odawak. It means that all the Odawa, that's where all of our territory was. So all of this whole area here of the Robinson Huron Treaty area. And you could also see where St. Ignace, Michigan is there, and Michilimackinac. It says Village of the Odawaks. So it's showing where our territories need to be. And this is a map in 1744. It's a map of the Great Lakes, and a lot of it is in French. But I wanted to zoom in on this map, and it says Le Emiku Habitat Set Isle. And it's saying that the Mi'kmaq live on this island. So these people, the Mi'kmaq, they live on this island, and that's in 1744. So it's actually showing that during the 18th century, that our people were living on Manitoulin. And so some of the dominant Eurocentric historiography says that the island was empty during this time, but that's actually not the case, that there was always occupation on Manitoulin. And this is a map that shows that this is in 1744, and it's saying that the Mi'kmaq are living on Manitoulin at the time. So during this time, around 1760, after the 7 Years' War, General Amherst, he orders Robert Rogers and George Croghan to go to Detroit. So at this time, the Anishinaabeg are not a part of the Covenant chain. This is shortly after, right when the 7 Years' War ends. And we were helping the French in the war. So they meet a party of Odawa warriors who come from Detroit at the Cayuga River, which is Cleveland, Ohio. So Pontiac is among them. So this is the first time that the British meet Pontiac. So he meets Major Rogers, and they have a pipe ceremony there on November 7th, 1760. So November 20th, 1760, the British meet 400 warriors at the entrance of the Maumee River, which is the present-day Toledo, Ohio. And there was a large Odawa village there around just south of Detroit. So this is a quote that William Johnson, that this is a quote that expresses our relationship that we have with the British. And it says, as long as the sun shone, the grass grew, the rivers flowed, and the British wore red coats, the king would deliver his warmth in the form of valuable presents so that our people would know no want. In 1755, Sir William Johnson said the king directed him to light up a large council fire at my house in the Mohawk country, where allies of the crown would receive the benefit of that relationship. So in 1760, Sir William Johnson kindled a second fire at Detroit to extend the king's warmth, symbolized it in wampum belt of 9 rows. So in 1760, the British go to Detroit and they invite all the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. All the chiefs are there in November and December of 1760. And the Odawa come down from Michilimackinac. They travel down to Detroit and they have this big conference with the British known as the Detroit. I guess what I would call it is the Detroit Peace Conference in 1760. So this is a picture of the belt, the Detroit belt. So this belt is in Detroit at the Detroit Historical Society, the Treaty of Detroit. And this is a picture of, there was actually a deed that came with this land deed that came with this agreement, with this treaty. And it says that all the nations from north of Detroit all the way up to northern Michigan, it's talking about these two rivers that are in the upper peninsula of Michigan, all the way west to probably where around Ashland, Wisconsin is at that time. This whole area is talking about all of these people, these Nishnabek, these Odawa that were living in the area. This is the agreement they make with them, that they bring them into this covenant chain in 1760. So shortly after that, General Amherst he discontinues the gift diplomacy. So he's saying that he doesn't want to give the Anishinaabe these gifts anymore. That the French had always given the Anishinaabe gifts. So this gift diplomacy meant that if Europeans were going to come and use our lands, that they would pay us and they would give us these gifts as a form of rent for using our lands. So Amherst discontinues the gifts, and there's more settler encroachment coming into Anishinaabe, so coming into Michigan. So they don't abide by the agreement they just made. They just made an agreement in 1760 at the Treaty of Detroit. So they go to war. The Anishinaabe people go to war. So after the 7 Years' War, the Odawa chief Pontiac declared that Britain had not defeated the Anishinaabe nation within the Great Lakes area. So this conflict forced the British Crown to amend policies to the 1763 Royal Proclamation regarding clauses to Indigenous nations, which were specific to their land title and ownership. So in February of 1763, at the Treaty of Paris, when they first had the Treaty of Paris ending the 7 Years' War, there was no clauses there talking about Indigenous lands. But by that summer, when Pontiac's War had started in April and May of 1763, they rushed this proclamation through the British Crown, I guess you could say through the British Parliament at the time. And in June of 1763, they start to make clauses to the Royal Proclamation, and they add these clause there about Indigenous lands. So eventually on October 7th, 1763, they have the Royal Proclamation. So Sir William Johnson declared the Royal Proclamation was in force on December 23rd, 1763, and he delivered copies to all the native allies. So they sent runners all over the Great Lakes, and they showed a copy of this Royal Proclamation. So Sir William Johnson made a treaty with the Senecas in April of 1764, and a second treaty made with them at Niagara. So Fort Niagara Treaty was successfully negotiated on August 1st, 1764 with the Lakes Confederacy. So the Lakes Confederacy is the Odawa Confederacy, or the Tree Fires Confederacy, the Western nations, all the nations that lived in Michigan and the Western Great Lakes. Those were known as the Lakes Confederacy. So in the historical record, I also found that they're also known as the Odawa Confederacy or the Ottawa Confederacy. This is who they're referring to. So this is the 1763 Royal Proclamation. That's just a picture of how the proclamation looks. And this is a map showing the indigenous territory. So everything that's west of the Appalachian Mountains and east of the Mississippi. So all of this territory in between, they're calling it the Indian Territory. So Manitoulin Island is within that area. So these lands, and in the proclamation, it says that only the crown could purchase lands from the indigenous people. So settlers or private property owners could not purchase land from indigenous peoples. It only goes through the crown, that everything flows between the crown and the indigenous people based on this nation to nation relationship. And in the proclamation, it says, with whom we are connected. The 1763 Royal Proclamation makes a distinction between nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and those who live under our protection. So connected means nation to nation with military or trade relations, and protection, crown jurisdiction over individuals and territories. So this resulted in the Treaty of Niagara of 1764. So when our people decided to agree to this agreement, this royal proclamation, we wanted to ratify it through wampum, and it took place at the Treaty of Niagara in 1764. So in 1764 at Niagara, we had 24 nations that were there. There was the Haudenosaunee and 7 nations. And then we had the Western Confederacy, as we could see at the bottom, the Ojibwe, also known as the Chippewa. There was the Menominees, the Fox, the Cree, the Potawatomis, the Ottawa, who are the Odawa, the Sauk, the Winnebagos, the Huron, the Algonquins. So this was all the Western Confederacy. These were all the nations who were at the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. So the Niagara Conference actually took place over 6 weeks. It started at the beginning of July and it ended on the first week of August. So on August 1st of 1764. And this is a picture of the belts, the 1764 belt. The Silver Covenant chain belt looks like this. So this was the belt that was given to the Western nations, to the Anishinaabeg people. And this is when the Anishinaabeg are adopted into the covenant chain, that relationship we have with the crown, with the British crown. And at another belt that was there was called the 24 Nations belt. And that's a picture of it at the bottom. So this belt represents the 24 nations that were at the 1764 treaty. And it shows all of the 24, it shows all the men. They're all holding hands. So linking arms, they're all together in alliance, all these 24 nations. So that's again, representing that alliance, that covenant chain alliance. So that's the 1764 Treaty of Niagara belt and the 24 nations annual presence belt. And what that represents is that the 24 nations, this annual presence belt, this alliance, where it's made out of a silver chain, they would say that when we needed gifts, when they would bring gifts over from Britain, over the ocean, our people would tug on that chain, and they would bring the gifts over, and that represented that gift diplomacy that existed between the crown and our people. So today, those would be in form of what we call our treaty payments or our treaty agreements that we have. They would represent. That's the way I see it. Is these payments, these treaty annuities or different. We still have this gift diplomacy today between us and the government, the Canadian government, and it's represented through this covenant chain alliance. And this is just a picture of William Johnson's house. This is him distributing peace medals at Johnson Hall. So his house was called Johnson Hall, and it was over in the Mohawk country. So William Johnson was the superintendent for the British Department at the time. So we're part of the Silver Covenant chain after 1764. So British created a Silver Covenant chain and connected many Native nations together in a chain of friendship. So this would allow us to trust one another, and it would be an ongoing friendship. So again, that's a picture of the Covenant chain belt that represents that alliance, that silver chain, the ongoing friendship that we have between us and the British Crown. And this is a quote from a British official in 1783. He says, "Indians have heard of boundaries. Look upon our conduct to them as treacherous and cruel. Indians were a free people, subject to no power upon earth, that they were faithful allies of the King of England, but not his subjects. We betrayed them by pretending to give up their country to the Americans without their consent or without consulting them." So he's acknowledging that we were not subjects of the crown, that we were allies to the crown, and that they actually betrayed us at the Peace of Paris after the American Revolution. So this is in 1783, and that they gave the land to the Americans without consulting us. So that actually erupts into a large war known as the Northwest Indian War that happens between 1785 and 1795, and all of the territories in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, all the nations that live there, parts of Northern Ontario, we all band together, known as the Northwestern Confederacy. We went to war against the Americans. So the Silver Covenant chain acknowledged one another as allies, informed each other about issues of concern, made amends for any transgressions. They offered expressions of condolence for the losses suffered, sought justice on a variety of political, economic, and social matters, renewed peaceful relations, agreed on a mutually beneficial course of action. So these are some of the policies we had with the British Crown under the Silver Covenant chain. So these are what I call treaty obligations. So to provide for general welfare, to show patience and trust, so right the wrongs, protect our homelands, protect our hunting grounds, keeping the king's subjects from encroaching, refrain from hostilities, provide mutual defense and protection. So see, these are some of the reasons why indigenous peoples made treaties with Europeans or with the British, and later on, the treaties we made with the Americans. So our people, the Odawa, first we had their relationship with the French crown, and then with the British crown, and then with the American Republic, and then with the Canadian government after. So that's kind of like the history of our relationship that we had with the Europeans. So in 1786, Sir William Johnson renewed the covenant chain. So this is after the American Revolution. So he wanted to make sure that we were still in alliance with the British after the American Revolution. So he extended the covenant chain to renew and pledge the alliance to the Western nations. And this is the belt, the 1786, the Pledge of Renewal belt that Sir William Johnson sent. So at the time, it was in Michilimackinac. That's where all the main Odawa village was at the time, at La Arbor Cross, just south of Mackinac City today, where present-day Harbor Springs, Michigan would be. So that's where the largest Odawa village was at the time, at this time. And this is in 1786. So the 1786 Pledge of Renewal on July 25th, 1786, Sir John Johnson renewed the covenant chain with the Anishinaabeg and presented a wampum belt to them, known today as the 1786 Pledge of Renewal wampum belt. In the fall of 1786, the British held a large conference with both the Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee at Brownstown, just south of Detroit. These Indigenous council meetings that took place between November and December of 1786 would be the first conversations surrounding a revised Northwestern Confederacy. Mohawk leader Joseph Brant was trying to get the Haudenosaunee to join the Western Confederacy in a new political alliance to form a new confederacy, one that would live in the dish with one spoon region in the Ohio country. This renewed alliance with the British included the Shawnees, the Delawares, the Ohio Seneca, the Wyandots, also known as the Huron and the Patons, the Miami, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. So they were trying to form this new alliance called the Northwestern Confederacy, and they wanted to protect all the lands that were in that whole territory. So all of like Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Northern Ontario, around Lake Superior, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And they were trying to, and they wanted to make an alliance between all of these indigenous nations. So the Jay Treaty of 1794 on November 19th, 1794, following the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So at Fallen Timbers, the Anishinaabe fought this major war against the Americans, and we had some major victories in 1791 at the defeat of Arthur St. Clair. But we were defeated at Fallen Timbers, and the U.S. and Britain negotiated an agreement that defined the Treaty of Amity, Conference and Navigation, also known as the Jay Treaty. It was ratified by the U.S. Senate on June 24th, 1795, and ratified by Britain. It formally took effect on February 29, 1796. The Jay Treaty was an act of peace between the U.S. and Britain. The U.S. wanted the British to withdraw from the Great Lakes region and the Northwest Territory. The British wanted a buffer zone of protection between Upper Canada and the United States if war should ever break out again. The British Crown spoke on behalf of the First Nations at the Jay Treaty negotiations in an attempt to create an independent, sovereign Indigenous state between the US and Canada. So the British knew that they could not cede land that legally belonged to First Nations. So they knew that the land belonged to us, that they could not they couldn't take it illegally, that they had to abide by that Royal Proclamation of 1763. And they knew that we were trying to form an independent Indigenous nation state in the area with that revised North Confederacy that they were trying to form. So the Indigenous nations were also faithful military allies to the British Crown, abiding by the covenant chain. The compromise was Article 3 of the Jay Treaty, where First Nations were considered independent nations separate from the British Crown and the US, who were not subject of colonial powers. So in the Jay Treaty, there's actually three nations that are defined in the Jay Treaty. There's actually the British Crown, which is Canada, and then there's the US, the Americans, and then there's us, the Indigenous people. And it says that we're not subjects of the Americans or the Canadians. So the international border between the US and Canada does not apply to First Nations, who are allowed to travel freely at the border crossings. So that's still in effect today. That's considered our Jay Treaty rights of 1794. In Brownstown, so Brownstown was like the capital of this Northwestern Confederacy. It was a large Indigenous village that was south of Detroit. So in September 1794, the chief of the Hurons, known as the Crane, wrote a letter to General Wayne proposing peace with the U.S. So they wanted to make peace with the U.S. So the governor of Upper Canada, John Simcoe, traveled to Brownstown. which was the capital of the Red Confederacy, on October 13, 1794. So Simcoe explained to the United Indian Nations why the British did not support them at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. He then asked the Red Confederacy to maintain their alliance with the British, and Simcoe assured that the indigenous nations that the British would welcome the indigenous peoples of the Red Confederacy to live in Upper Canada. So this is when a lot of indigenous peoples who were living in Michigan started to move to what today is Ontario, which is Southern Ontario. So Simcoe also told the Red Confederacy leaders that the British would protect them from their enemies. So Simcoe presented a wampum belt to the council at Brownstown. So what happened at the Battle of Fallen Timbers was that the British did not give us any aid. They didn't help us in that battle when we were fighting the Americans, and we were trying to retreat to the fort, and the British actually closed the gates on us. So their relationship with the crown was pretty much tainted at the time. So Simcoe is trying to assure the indigenous nations. He's explaining to them how come they didn't support them at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, is because the British could not afford to go to war against the Americans. Um, they had lost to them in the American Revolution, and there was a lot of different wars going on in Europe, different revolutions happening at the time. So the British they couldn't afford a war at the time. So this is what happens in 1794. So this is a picture of the belt that Simcoe presents to the indigenous nations there at Brownstown. That's known as the IGS belt or the Simcoe belt. That's the one on the left. And that's the Jay Treaty belt that's on the right. So that's the belt that was presented to the indigenous nations on behalf of the Jay Treaty of 1794. So that's known as the Jay Treaty belt. So Tecumseh and the War of 1812. So like Pontiac during the end of the Seven Years' War, Tecumseh was a significant Shawnee leader during the War of 1812. Tecumseh and Tekakwitha both united a pan-indigenous confederacy in the Northwest Territory. The involvement of the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee during this war was significant. The indigenous nations during the War of 1812 were vital to the victories of the British during the first battles of the conflict. So Phil Belfie, in his book, he states, Tecumseh and many other Native leaders had never accepted the terms of the Treaty of Greenville. Their position, supported by a great number of Native groups and based on the provisions of the earlier Confederacy, was the vitality of any land cession was dependent upon an agreement by all the region's tribes. Although the British were the enemy in 1755, the Anishinaabeg followed Tecumseh and fought for the British due to the gift diplomacy between the Anishinaabeg and British after the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. This gift diplomacy, which was built off the French policy, was serving the Anishinaabeg well. So we were fighting for our independent nation state. So that Northwestern Confederacy that was revived in 1794 and 1795, and all those council meetings that took place at Brownstown. What was happening at that time was that all the indigenous nations were getting together, um, and that's what we were fighting for in the War of 1812. So this is what's happening at this time. So at this time, the British are ready to go to war against the Americans, and it's actually us that actually start that war, the War of 1812, because we were ready to go before that. So like in around 1807, that Northwestern Confederacy was already intact, and they were ready for war. But it was the British who didn't want to go to war at the time. So the American policy of the distribution of gifts was only given to the Anishinaabe to pay off debts. So that was the American policy that they had. But the British policy of settler colonialism was less harsh than the American policy of disguised exploitation. The US Republic was not also firm in protecting settler encroachment onto indigenous lands. So the US didn't really abide by their treaties that they made with the indigenous nations that a lot of settlers were pushing west. So the past Cecil Kingba, he describes the Anishinaabe version of their involvement in the War of 1812 by stating, he says, the Juggernautshuk were eager to attract our support. We had been important partners in the fur trade, and it was obvious to the Juggernaut leaders that we were essential to their cause. If they were to defend their territory in Canada, the relations between the Juggernautshuk and the Kitchimokmanak, the Big Knives, the AKA the Americans, were tense. The Juggernautshuk were vulnerable in Canada. They needed the support of our people and our allied nations. So the British, the settlers in Southern Ontario at the time, they really needed our help in the War of 1812. They could not have fought the Americans by themselves because the British were actually fighting a war, the Napoleonic Wars over in Europe, and it was the indigenous people, the Anishinaabe people, who were vital to the major battles at the beginning of the War of 1812. So the Battle of Michilimackinac on July 17, 1812, Fort Michilimackinac was captured from the U.S. without firing a shot. 300 Odawa and Ojibwe and 150 Sioux, Winnebago, and Menominee warriors, along with 200 French fur traders, attacked the Americans at Michilimackinac. The Anishinaabe had defended their lands from the Americans. In October of 1813, Tecumseh died on the battlefield on the Thames River in Moraviantown, Ontario. The Ojibwe chief from Boating, Shingwak, had fought with Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames. Other Anishinaabe from the North Shore of Manitoulin and Boating also lost their lives at the battle. Phil Belfie describes how this affected the Indigenous Confederacy by stating, with Tecumseh's death, the War of 1812 was essentially over, and any native hopes for driving the Americans out of their territory were dashed. The British, while lamenting the death of Tecumseh, were pleased that they and their native allies had kept the United States out of Canada and thus regarded the war as a victory. So at this time, the Anishinaabe, they controlled the Western Great Lakes region. So there were about 8,410 Indigenous warriors who fought in the War of 1812 under Tecumseh, while 7,410 were Anishinaabe from Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Manitoulin, the North Shore of Lake Huron, Lake Superior, and Lake Nipissing. So the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi had not been conquered in their homelands. After the War of 1812, the Anishinaabe were still in control of the upper Great Lakes. So this is all of north of Lake Superior, Northern Ontario. It's all Anishinaabe people living there. So despite this, the British had surrendered Fort Michilimackinac to the U.S., and the distribution of presents would have to be moved to British territory in Canada. On June 3rd, 1815, the Odawa chief Mukade Benesse tried to get the British to get back the island of Michilimackinac for them, which was ceded to the U.S. at Greenville in 1795. So the War of 1812 was fought between 1812 and 1815 between the U.S. and Canada. So about 10,000 Indigenous veterans fought alongside the British against the Americans as allies from sovereign nations. So this included about 2,000 Anishinaabe veterans from Manitoulin and the North Shore. The U.S. wanted to counter the Indigenous threat in the Northwest frontier and eliminate British control in the Great Lakes region. They wanted to control the North American trade and economy. So basically, whoever controlled the Great Lakes, they controlled the continent, the access to the interior, to the rest of the continent, and that's what the war was really about. It was really about that geographic region, and the Americans wanted to push that boundary from Sault Ste. Marie across the North Shore to the French River to Lake Nipissing to the Ottawa River down to Montreal. They wanted all that land south of there to be United States, and they wanted that 49th parallel to go straight across. And that's why the Americans why one of the main reasons why they went to war in the War of 1812 was control over the Great Lakes. So in 1818, there was a conference at Drummond Island, and there were some wampum belts that were brought out. And Makadeb Benessa speaks, the Odawa chief at the time, and he recites the belts. So 1764 belt was there, the 24 Nations Annual Presence belt, and there was a new belt after the War of 1812 belt, the McDowell belt that was given after the War of 1812 to the Nishnabek. And then the 1786 alliance with the British Crown. So this belt, this Pledge of Renewal belt in 1786, it was also at this council in 1818 at Drummond Island. So these were the four belts that were brought up at that council in 1818. And this is the Tecumseh Peace Belt from the War of 1812. And this is known as the Pledge of the Crown Wampum Belt. Some people call this the William Claus Belt. So it was given as a token that the government would never force the Indians to change their customs. And this quote is by a Six Nations wampum keeper in 1887, John Buck. And that's what he says, that this belt was given to the indigenous people after the War of 1812, known as the Pledge of the Crown Wampum Belt. So I talked about the Royal Proclamation. So the Royal Proclamation is a foundational document in the legal history of Indigenous and Canadian relations for federal policy. Historically, colonial governments were forbidden to allow British subjects or settlers to settle on Indigenous lands and or private individuals to purchase Indigenous lands. There was an official system of public purchases developed in order to extinguish Indian title. Following the War of 1812, the British would distribute presents or gifts to acknowledge the alliance of the Covenant chain. This included any Indigenous peoples who were living on the U.S. sphere of influence. In the early 19th century, Indigenous nations did not acknowledge the U.S.-Canadian border until 1833. So before 1833, there was a lot of Odawa who were just going back and forth from Michigan to Manitoulin. So like from the Arbor Cross, that whole area, we didn't recognize. It was not until 1833 that the Americans really wanted to stop any Anishinaabe who were living in the U.S. at the time on their side of the territory. They didn't allow them. They had to choose. The Anishinaabe had to choose where to live. They had to pick Canada or they had to pick the United States. They couldn't go back and forth anymore. And that was in 1833 that they kind of forced the Odawa people to choose where they want to live. So after the War of 1812, from 1818 onward, Britain replaced one-time payments of treaties with annuity treaty payments. This resulted in the pre-Confederation treaties in Canada. The Indigenous peoples preferred this method because it was aligning with the traditional system of gift diplomacy. The ceremonial exchange of the annual presents was given in exchange for the sharing of the lands with the settlers. The annuities were to increase with inflation as natural resource extraction increased. So Indian land cessions in Upper Canada in the decade following the War of 1812, Indigenous peoples from southern Ontario faced intensified settler encroachment onto their territories. They were pressured to give up their lands through various treaties. The British wanted to create a buffer zone with the U.S. south of the Great Lakes. Although most of the settlers were English-speaking loyalists who came from the U.S. side, who were loyal to the British Crown, the government still wanted immigrants from Britain to settle in Upper Canada. So at the time, after the War of 1812, people who were still loyal to the British, they came to live in Upper Canada, but the Canadian government were encouraging a lot of immigration from Britain at the time. And what happened was there was a flood of settlers start to move into southern Ontario. And then that's when all of these towns in southern Ontario started to pop up. And when Toronto, the town of York was actually established after the War of 1812. And so these settlers eventually started to move north. They wanted to move into Northern Ontario. So civilization program, Sir John Johnson retired in 1828. He was the son of Sir William Johnson, who died in 1774. Between 1828 to 1830, a new Indian policy began, and they did not need Anishinaabeg as military allies any longer. So we were considered allies before, and now they didn't really need us anymore. And the US was scared to fight Britain, and Britain was scared to fight the US. And after the War of 1812. So John Colborne, 1826 to 1836, wanted to give gifts as a peace gesture, but at the expense of leasing Indian land. So what happened was they started leasing Indian land and they started selling Indian land, and they used the money from the sales of this Indian land to to make the treaty payments. That's actually where they got the money to from the sale of indigenous lands. So the British Crown wanted to create a new Indian Department where the sales of Indian land would be used to finance the social policies of Indians who would all reside on Manitoulin. So they wanted to make this civilization program. The Crown wanted Indians to become farmers and assimilate into the mainstream white society. When Bonhead became governor in 1836, he developed a different plan because of his former work experience on other continents. So Bonhead had actually come from South America, and he was known as a social engineer, where he was experienced in assimilating indigenous people into white society. That's actually why he was brought into Upper Canada. So he makes this assimilation experiment, and they want to move all the Anishinaabe, all the indigenous peoples to Manitoulin. But at the same time, we had the Indian Removal Act of 1830. While the Southern Odawa of the Grand River negotiated with the Americans in southern Michigan and Ohio, the Northern Odawa towards the Arbor Cross and Michilimackinac continued to receive their presents from the British at Drummond Island. The nations were allies to the British Crown during the War of 1812, traveled to Drummond Island during the 1820s to practice their gift diplomacy. In 1821, records show that 3,333 Anishinaabe went to Drummond Island to get their presents. In 1830, U.S. President Andrew Jackson proposed the Indian Removal Act, where the Republic wanted all indigenous peoples to move west of the Mississippi River to Indian Territory, which is later renamed Oklahoma. In 1836, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British government in Upper Canada also initiated an Indian removal policy of isolation for Indigenous peoples in Ontario. So at the same time, what's happening in Ontario on the Canadian side is that they want all the Indigenous peoples to move to Manitoulin. And what's happening in the US is they want all the Indigenous peoples to move west of the Mississippi. So the government was considering Manitoulin Island as an Indian territory in Upper Canada. So they were trying to create their own Indian territory here in Upper Canada in Ontario, and they had picked Manitoulin Island. By the early 1830s, the Northern Odawa and Michigan were being surrounded by too many American settlers to maintain the sole occupation of their vast territory. So Indigenous British relations in the early 19th century. So there was a shift from military alliances to civilians for Indigenous people, and the relationship between the government and First Nations changed drastically. Before 1830, the government treated First Nations as powerful allies and as nations. But after 1830, the government wanted to create Indian reserves or settlements very close to settler towns. This began to take place in southern Ontario, where officials wanted to build schools on First Nations. So what happens at this time is that they put these settler towns right beside the Indian Reserve, and they actually did that on purpose. They did that by design because they thought that the Anishinaabeg would assimilate quicker into white society if a white town was right beside the First Nation. So that's why we have all of these First Nations in Ontario, and there's a white town right beside it, or not too far from it, and that was actually done by design. So assimilation experiments during the 1830s, two settlements were created as assimilation experiments. One was in Coldwater, the other in Manitowoc on Manitoulin Island. They encouraged Indigenous people from various regions in Upper Canada into one large settlement. The government provided day schools, farm equipment, and sawmills. But the day schools did did prove did not prove to be as successful as the government had hoped. Indigenous children were still able to live amongst their community members and still be immersed in their language and culture. This would be the beginning signs of the infamous residential schools. The first Indian day schools had curriculum in both English and Anishinaabe. So when they first had these day schools on the First Nations in the early 19th century, some of our Anishinaabe leaders actually wanted the curriculum to be both in English and Anishinaabe. So when they first made these schools, that's how it was. It wasn't until Edgar Ryerson in 1847 they changed all of that. And they didn't want the Anishinaabe to be spoken in the schools. So the 1836 Treaty of Washington. So Drummond Island was being used by white settlers, and the Anishinaabe wanted compensation for it. So there were Odawa chiefs at Wiikwemkoong that wanted compensation for settlers using Drummond Island. Chief DeBosque, who originally lived on Drummond Island, but was living at Wiikwemkoong at the time, traveled to Michilimackinac to see U.S. officials regarding Drummond Island. Chief DeBosque, Tebosque, Nigomquam, and the Sikanak all voiced their concerns over Drummond Island. In 1835, Wiikwemkoong and the Arbor Cross chiefs requested to see the U.S. President Jackson. In 1835, the Grand River Southern Odawa were devastated by smallpox epidemic, forcing them to move north towards the Arbor Cross. The Grand River Odawa also experienced a shortage of deer to hunt for food due to the number of settlers hunting on their lands. Schoolcraft told his superiors that the Odawa would welcome a treaty if they received large Indian reservations and retained their hunting rights on the ceded lands. They only wanted to sell Drummond Island, the Manitou Island in northern Michigan, and lands in the Upper Peninsula. Michigan Governor Horner and Indian agent Schoolcraft both wanted to extinguish Aboriginal title to these lands and open it up for European settlement. In the fall of 1835, Odawa chiefs from the Arbor Cross named Augustine Hamilton and Apostoligan traveled to Washington, D.C. to conduct a treaty with the U.S. president. They wanted to sell some of their lands and to prevent relocation to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. This trip also motivated the Grand River Odawa to send some of their leaders to the U.S. Capitol. They also want to reject the idea of relocating west of the Mississippi and preventing the Arbor Cross Odawa from selling their lands without consultation. The Grand River delegation, comprised of one chief, Mukta Tusha, and Baptist missionaries Slater and McCoy, who acted as translators and guardians of the Odawa interests since they understood European politics. A delegation from Bowading, led by Chief Wishki, uncle-in-law to Indian agent Schoolcraft, also traveled to D.C. to negotiate the land cessions, the annuities, and removal with the U.S. Republic through the treaty. So this was the 1836 Treaty of Washington in northern Michigan that the Odawa conducted with the U.S. government. So all the lands in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So this is in March of 1836. So what happens at that time is a lot of Anishinaabe from the Arbor Cross Odawa moved to Manitoulin. They moved to Wiikwemkoong at this time because Wiikwemkoong, Manitoulin Island, was seen as another Anishinaabe territory where there a lot of Anishinaabe people were starting to move to Manitoulin. So that's when we see a lot of these families from Larbour Cross move into Wiikwemkoong. So Anishinaabeg Nation territory, before Governor Bonhead had proposed a plan for the Anishinaabeg territory, the Three Fires Confederacy held a council with 84 Ogimok of the Anishinaabeg at Saugeen. There were 34 chiefs from Upper Canada, and they hailed from Lake St. Clair, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, Lake Simcoe, Rice Lake, and Mud Lake. The purpose of the Grand Council was to devise a plan to set aside Odawa-Minis, Manitoulin Island, and the Saugeen Territory to be held for the sole use of the Ojibwe Nation, the Anishinaabe. The Ogimok wanted the British government to set up a manual labor school and asked the rest of the nation of how they felt about having their own sovereign nation within this tract of land, which was the Bruce Peninsula and Manitoulin Island. So they had a large council. This was before Bonhead came to Manitoulin. All the Anishinaabe chiefs, so 84 Anishinaabe chiefs from all over Ontario, they wanted their own sovereign Anishinaabe territory on Manitoulin and the Bruce Peninsula. So this was their vision that they had at the time. And they wanted schools. They wanted to have our own schools, but they wanted the curriculum to be both in English and Anishinaabe at the same time. So this was a vision that the chiefs had at the time. So this is just before 1836. So social isolation. In 1835, Sir Francis Bonhead arrived in Upper Canada as the new lieutenant governor. He arrived from South America and served as a social engineer for Indigenous peoples in the New World. He encouraged the Indian reserve system to be replaced with the Indigenous socialization. Instead, he picked Manitoulin Island as the region for Indians to die out completely in peace. He started to take various land surrenders and relocate the Anishinaabe to Manitoulin or Wiikwemkoong. So this is a picture of Bonhead, and he was the one who thought that all the Indigenous peoples were going to eventually die off, and he wanted them all to live on Manitoulin. So the Bonhead Agreement in 1836, from the Anishinaabe perspective, reducing gift diplomacy was also reducing the reciprocal responsibilities from the Crown. So Bonhead wanted to get rid of the gifts as well. So this was threatened by the 1836 treaty with the British Crown. Bonhead's full intentions to terminate the gifts were hidden from the Anishinaabe when he came to Manitoulin to negotiate the 1836 agreement. He hid the fact that the British Crown intended to decrease and eventually discontinue the obligations of gift diplomacy. The Anishinaabe went to Manitoulin to receive their annual gifts. Bonhead proposed to link the Treaty of Niagara of 1764 with his 1836 treaty. The Anishinaabe reminded Bonhead that their relationship must be defined by the agreement at Niagara through wampum, through the two-row agreement and the 1764 wampum belt. As Siganak stated, 70 snow seasons ago have now passed since we met in the council at the Quicker Place, Niagara, at which time your great father, the King of Indians in North America, tied their hands together by the wampum of friendship. So that was said at the Bonhead Agreement. I actually, that speech, I think it was actually Bonhead who said the speech, but I need to do more research if it was a Siganak or Bonhead that speaks about the wampum at Niagara. But basically, they're acknowledging that this agreement, this 1836 Bonhead Agreement, had to go through everything they agreed to at the 1764 Treaty of Niagara. That everything flowed through the Treaty of Niagara. Whatever they agreed to at Niagara, so they were acknowledging that Royal Proclamation, all the agreements they had at the Treaty of Niagara, that it was the same agreements they were going to have in 1836 at the Bonhead Agreement. So there was no surrender of the Anishinaabe territory in 1836 of Manitoulin. So the Anishinaabe considered Manitoulin Island as a sovereign Anishinaabe territory. So we have the pre-Confederation treaties, the Manitoulin Treaty of 1836. So settlers moved into Upper Canada. Indigenous communities in Southern Ontario faced intensified encroachment. So Bonhead wanted all the Indigenous communities to move to Manitoulin Island. So what happened was the Anishinaabe only welcomed other Indigenous nations to reside on Manitoulin. It was Anishinaabe territory, as stated in the 1764 Treaty of Niagara Covenant Chain. No surrender of Manitoulin took place in 1836. So we had issues in the mid-19th century. There were still international border disputes and tensions over the Great Lakes. American and Canadian commercial fishermen were feuding over resources of fish in Lake Huron. By 1830, there were about 24 trading posts around Manitoulin Island. So these were fishing stations. So what happened was that the Anishinaabe wanted to generate revenue for the Anishinaabe Nation, and what they wanted to do was they wanted to lease these little fishing stations to commercial fishermen, where the commercial fishermen would come onto the shore and clean their fish and then put their fish back on their boats, and they would pay the Anishinaabe. But what happened was that the governor general started to give the licenses to the commercial fishermen, so they're able to acquire their own leases for their fishing stations. So the governor general started approving these fishing licenses without consulting with the Anishinaabe. And then the British wanted to open Manitoulin to settlers. So this is how we get into the 1862 Treaty of Manitoulin. So there was a lot of mining that was happening on Lake Superior in 1841. So thousands of people passed through Sault Ste. Marie into Michigan's copper country, searching for minerals. So Canada West, which was Ontario, was known as Canada West between 1841 and 1867, brought the north shore of the Upper Canada Lakes under its legislative control in 1841. William Logan, who was a geologist, speculated about the North Shore's mineral potential. And he issued the first mineral exploration license in 1845. In 1846, Canada West started to survey the shore of Lake Superior, Sault Ste. Marie's plot, and the mineral claims to the east of the village. This included the Anishinaabe settlement under Shinwalk's leadership at Garden River. So these British mining companies, they start to come into Northern Ontario in 1845. The province of Canada granted permission for mining companies to extract natural resources from Northern Ontario along the coast of Lake Superior. So the Ojibwe leader Shinwalk, he asked the governor, he says, "Can you lay claim to our land? If so, by what right? Have you not conquered it from us? You have not. For when you first came among us, your children were few and weak, and the war cry of the Ojibwe struck terror to the hearts of the paleface." So those were the words of Shinwalk. And he's saying that the British, the settlers, cannot come and mine. So we have the Mika Bay incident on November 1849. So there was a force of Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Métis warriors led by Chiefs Ashawano, Shinwakos, and Niben Kushching forced the Quebec and Lake Superior Mining Association to stop operating at Mika Bay on Lake Superior. So Mika Bay is approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Sault Ste. Marie on Lake Superior. So the closure of the mine and the reaction of the Canada West authorities are known as the Mika Bay incident. So that resulted into the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. There was a boom in mining, forestry, and fisheries within the north shore of Lake Huron. This resulted with the encroachment of settlers who wanted the British Crown to establish a treaty with the Lake Huron and Anishinaabe. This treaty stated that Anishinaabe fishing economy would be protected. Most Anishinaabe communities stayed where their traditional fishing stations were already established. So this is just a copy of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And so that was the events that led up to the Robinson-Huron Treaty. So the Manitoulin Treaty of 1862. So prior to 1862, Manitoulin was a sovereign, unsurrendered Anishinaabe territory. Anishinaabe had leased fishing stations to Euro settlers previously. As a result of the 1858 Fisheries Act, more European settlers started to encroach within the Manitoulin area, and they pressured the government to open Manitoulin for settlement. In October 1861, all the Manitoulin chiefs refused to sign, but a year later, all the chiefs were influenced to sign, except for Wiikwemkoong. The eastern portion of the island became unceded. And that is actually the end of my presentation. And that's all I have for you guys for tonight. Miigwech. I guess we could open up the floor just for a few minutes. I could take some questions for the next 5-10 minutes. If anybody has any questions. I noticed Treaty Awareness Week was about regarding the 1850 annuities and why Wiikwemkoong is involved in the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And there's been a lot of questions. People have asked me, since Wiikwemkoong is unceded, why are we part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty? And the answer I give is that when I show those maps, when I show all of the territory was all belonging to Odawa people, to all the Ojibwe, the Odawa, who all lived in Northern Ontario, Manitoulin Island, that our territory, it just didn't end where Manitowoc Bay and South Bay is. Our territory went all over Manitoulin, all over the North Shore, all the way up to Sudbury, all the way up towards Timmins, and we hunted. We utilized all of that land for thousands of years. So it is still our territory. They did conduct a treaty in our territory in 1850, and although our chiefs did not, like some of our chiefs went to the 1850 treaty signing, but although we didn't sign the 1862 treaty and the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty, that land was still a part of our people, that we're all related. We're all Anishinaabe people at one time. So it was this Indian reserve system that actually divided us. But before that, we were all united as one nation. And that's the way I see it, is that it's still part of our territory, and they're still extracting resources from our territory, and everybody should be getting annuities for it. All Wiikwemkoong band members, because we're all part of the Odawa Nation, and we're all Ojibwe, we're all Odawa, we're all Potawatomi, we're all part of the Tree Fires Confederacy, and the whole area all belong to us, and we're all one nation at one time. And that's the way I really look at it. And if people ask me why Wiikwemkoong is involved in the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty, and that's the answer I give. Now, how? Miigwech. Well, since there are no questions, I just wanted to say miigwech to everybody for coming out for listening tonight. And I hope we could bring more awareness to why Wiikwemkoong is involved in the Robinson Huron Treaty court case. What is the history of our region? That our territory just didn't extend on Manitoulin, but it extended all over. Our people have the history of traveling down to Chicago during the winter time, coming to Manitoulin in the summer, and our territory was vast. And the Odawa people, it was the U.S.-Canadian border that actually divided our people. And the Indian Reserve System that was set up actually divided our people. So we need to look for ways to unite our people and not be divided. Okay, I'm gonna say miigwech and I'm gonna say bamampi to miigwech for everybody that came out tonight.